The American empire is now over. A fundamental determinant of the malaise of our society, not understood and not admitted or recognized, is the degree to which the American working class now is shaped by the changing world economy. Whether you're trying to understand Trumpism or MAGAism or you name it, that's what you're looking at. You're looking at the working class coming to terms slowly, painfully, with as much resistance as they can muster. There's a reason why MAGA is the slogan. Why? Make America great. They know that there was something lost. You want people who will distract you from that, because it's a nagging worry already in the back of your mind.
Hello, this is Robinson Earhart, here with the introduction to Robinson's podcast number 222. And this episode is with Richard Wolff, who is Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a visiting professor at the New School, where he works on economics in the Marxist tradition. This is Richard's fourth appearance on the show. In episodes 127, 154, and 190, we covered criticisms of capitalism, myths of Marxism, and then the Israel-Palestine conflict, respectively. But in this quite wide-ranging conversation, we focus on the end of the American empire. More particularly, we get into the wars in Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Palestine, the rivalry between China and the United States, and then the conflict, also rivalry, between the BRICS nations and the G7 nations. And then we talk about a lot more. Richard's latest book is Understanding Capitalism, and we also discuss his book Class Theory and History, as well as his recent articles on understanding the 2024 elections in Europe and the United States, links to all of which you will find in the description. As always, reviews, etc. are extremely appreciated, especially at this time on Apple Podcasts, where I'm hovering just below a 5-star average rating. So if you're listening on Apple, that would be absolutely awesome. Then there's a Patreon if you'd like a link to an ad-free RSS feed to ask monthly AMA questions, and then there are also show notes. But now, without any further ado, I hope that you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with Richard. Before we started, you mentioned that there was this huge gap in the history curriculum. So I was just wondering what that is before we get to globalization of the economy.
All right, so I should mention, I went to college at Harvard, and so I'm supposed to be getting the best of my parents thought nobody hired, a philosophy and $2 you get on the subway.
Hasn't changed.
Yeah, I don't think so. So he offered me a compromise, my father, you study history. So I majored in history at college and got a history degree. I never regretted it. I loved learning about history, particularly European history. And I think in retrospect, it was because I wanted to understand the trauma of my parents, which could not be spoken. They couldn't talk to me about it. My father's sister was grabbed by the Gestapo and was killed in Auschwitz. My mother's parents were killed in another concentration camp. Yeah. So, and this traumatized them, as you can imagine. They were young people at the time. And so they didn't understand psychology very well. Otherwise, it might have occurred to them that they were communicating their trauma to their two children, my sister and myself, and that not speaking about it wouldn't mean it wasn't, but it would mean it wasn't discussed. You know, And as we now know, I married a psychiatrist.
I know, yeah. Is she a psychotherapist, by the way?
Psychotherapist. That's what she does for a living. Still does it. My daughter also. So it runs in the family.
Are they trained psychoanalysts as well, or
No, they
psychotherapy?
It's really psychotherapy that they do. I mean, they never went to medical school or anything like that. My cousins, I have cousins in France. It's the irony, they are both medical doctors as well as psychiatrists. But in France, there's no requirement like that. They don't believe in that. They believe psychology is separate from the medical. Whereas here, anyway. So the problem in Harvard in history, there were some good teachers, some real clunkers. But as I went through the 3 years, I took a lot of courses. I loved it. I loved learning what had happened, particularly in Europe, why my mother and my father, who didn't know each other in Europe and here, why they were driven out, what happened. How could these, I should mention, I grew up in a household which revered German philosophy and music. I grew up with Beethoven, Bach, Brahms. This was music. Everything else. When I listened to folk music, which I loved, and rock and roll, which I loved, my parents were distressed. This was a sign of, declining taste. For that. They didn't stop it, but they didn't like it. And I loved the class. I played the violin, and I liked doing it. I was given Goethe to read as a young person. My father was so distressed by the quality of high school education in this country that he supplemented it. So when I was 16, for my birthday, I got Plato's Dialogues to read and discuss with my father, which I did. By the way, it had nothing to do with Plato, which I learned from. I was happy with it. It was attention from my father. It was an engagement, because he was really into this. And he liked philosophy, so to get back to the question, he didn't want me to major in it. It's not because he didn't believe in it. Anyway, in the history courses, slowly, I became clearer and clearer. There's an screaming absence here. I liked the courses, they taught me a lot. But to make a long story short, economic history wasn't there. I learned about kings and queens. I learned about social movements. I learned about technical changes, political change. But when it came to understanding the economics underneath it, so I became, by its omission, a little Hegel here, by its omission, I became aware of the presence of an absence, Hegel's argument. And that was economics. So at the end of my time at Harvard, I had reached the conclusion that I liked doing history, but that I had to learn economics. While at Harvard, I took one economics course early on and found it to be childish mathematics. In other words, this person was intrigued by the ability to put up a quadratic equation or some other kind of equation because he thought that's terribly sophisticated, which was embarrassing because we had left that behind 2 years earlier in the math curriculum. So it was math for children. Because now as an economist, I have to do a certain amount of mathematics because it's being there. But I explained to them that your mathematics and economics is like a cookbook. It's not a book about nutrition or a book about the biology of eating. It's a recipe book, and you've taken a few math relationships and made them into a recipe for how to publish articles. Very nice. I don't give a shit one way or the other. But to think that you're doing a cutting edge, you're years behind in where math has gone, Yeah, and they never understood the conceptual issues of mathematics, so they were looking for little recipes. So I went to Stanford after Harvard and went to the economics department and started that. Then I went to Yale after that. I did all economics. And that was the compromise with my parents, to study what was missing. Later, I went back, and to a couple of my professors at Harvard, who, before they passed on, I asked them the question years later. I told them the story of the absence. And they looked at me and they said, "You know why, don't you?" I said, "I think I do, but I don't want to say. I want you to tell me why." They both gave me the same answer. And the answer is basically the Cold War. It was simply, and I mean simply, underscore the word simply, it was simply that to do economic history, in other words, to try to explain historical phenomena by focusing, not exclusively, but by giving emphasis to the economics, was too close to Marxism. And it would make people say, "What do you do?" "Oh, you mean the Marxist?" You did not want, even in a casual conversation, as one of them said, be, even in the faculty lunchroom on a rainy Thursday afternoon, you didn't want to be discussing what your research was with a colleague and have him or her say, in all innocence, "Oh, you mean like the Marxist?" Because that would be overheard by somebody, or by that colleague who asked, repeated innocently, not intending you any harm, and you would be stuck with a reputation that would be absolutely, you did not want, your career would be destroyed. This would be people who were more sympathetic to it, less sympathetic, really didn't matter. They were careful. It was like, don't touch a student inappropriately. You know the way people feel. I don't know about Stanford, but when I was at UMass, where I taught many years, there was a rule, which none of us observed, but there was a rule that when you met with a student in your office, you would have at least 6 inches of door opening. In other words, you couldn't do what you've just done. You'd have to keep it open. Can you imagine that? So, of course, no one gave a shit. Nobody. But it was a rule. And we were told periodically, "We've noticed that you don't have your door open," and said, you're brilliant. Then it's not. And then I did it anyway. Everybody did it. It wasn't just me. Anyway, that's why I ended up studying economics, because it was the irony. They thought they were preventing me, and I ended up Marxist, because that is the most developed version of this. And if you're not frightened, that's another issue why I wasn't frightened. But if you're not frightened, then you'll go there, of course. Also, I don't know how familiar you are, but the literature of Marxian economics is a literature, by the way, it has shit and crappy formulations, no question. But it has brilliant expositors. I mean, starting with Marx himself, but just, once you get into that, you're hooked, because you learn so much that you have an appreciation, like you would for anybody who's been a useful teacher to you at some point in your life. You just have this kind of a gratitude. That's what I have. I have a gratitude. You help me understand things that I didn't see before.
There's a lot to talk about now, and I have a very short question, but I think I'm going to ask it quite verbosely.
Okay.
Your parents were European. You mentioned that you speak French, German, English is your third language. You have this generational trauma. Your wife is a psychotherapist, and you're clearly very aware of your own psychological formation.
She leaves me no choice.
And what I'm wondering is, our loose agenda was to talk about global economics, and I'm wondering why you're interested in it. And one reason, this might be a deeper reason, is that global things have just been are a deep part of your psychology. And then the second thing is, you mentioned that you're interested in economics as something of an undercurrent of history that's missing. And I'm wondering if you use global economics as a tool to understand the undercurrent of what's happening in the present, as well as history.
So exactly what I do. It's very timely, because the last article I published, it only got released, I think, last week. I didn't send it to you, but if you want, I will send it to you. It's being published all over the place now, because I work through something called the Independent Media Institute. I don't know if you know them. But basically what they do is I write articles. They have a whole stable of writers. But I write articles, and then they place them all over the place. It gets me much more exposure than I can do myself. Anyway, that latest article is literally what you're asking me about. So let me state it in the simplest way I can. My life, literally, my conception by my parents, my upbringing, was overwhelmingly shaped by what you might call world events. I mean, that is true of every immigrant's family. Think about it. I'm the child. I was born in Ohio. I'm an American citizen by birth in the middle of the country. But I'm born to two refugees, a French and a German, a French man, a German woman. And what does that mean? They are unwillingly forced out of their country of origin. They are therefore disconnected, and I mean wrenched, radically yanked out of their language, their culture, their family, their community, you name it. I'll give you an example. My father went to law school, became a lawyer and a judge in Germany before he had to run. Okay. When I was born, he was pushing a wheelbarrow in something called the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company, a steelmaker. Okay. That's a fairly sudden change of venue, change of tradition, change of its skill, change of culture, change of everything. My mother was a good student, graduated from what in Germany is called Gymnasium. You know, okay, so it's above high school, not quite college, but in many ways ahead of what we do in college here. About to go to university, yanked out of all of that, and then my mother went into a concentration camp of the French. In French, she ran away from Germany, luckily, but the French had no papers, so the French stuck her in what they called personnage sans papier in French.
People without paper?
Okay, good.
Documents?
Yeah, no, that's good. Has another displaced person in English. Anyway, stuck in a camp like that for a while. She's a 22-year-old girl, young woman. So my parents are traumatized on almost every dimension of life. Their parents killed. My father never saw his parents again. He hid them before he left in France. He hid his own mother and father with a farmer in, if you know France a little bit, Normandy, heading towards the ocean, the rural area, basically. Dairy is, to this day, is what's famous for. And he paid a farmer to put his mother and father, my grandparents, in a barn, a little apartment that had been built at the top of a barn. So below was hay and animals, and above was a little apartment with a toilet and all that. And they spent the war there, my grandparents, hidden, because it was German occupied. And I'm just guessing at how it affected them because they couldn't speak about it. You see where the psychology comes. Why would I be interested in psychology? Well, I'd like to know what the hell who am I? So they come here, and what are they? They are a walking exemplar of how world affairs come and bite you right in the ass. I mean, you think you're going to escape from these abstract Hitlerism, Nazi, these could be, and they are for most Americans, vague abstractions. They may remember the definition, maybe if they read a book, a little bit realer, but it's distant. Not for me. That's not distant. That's right in there, in the guts of all the most immediate relationships and feelings that I have. So I think that's been with me all along. I think it had a lot to do. I mean, here's the joke. I got married when I was 23 to the woman I'm married to still.
Impressive.
Right? Yes. Real weird. Impressive. I almost married another young woman. And here's the thing. That other young woman is now a psychiatrist. Did go to medical school, became a psychiatrist. So I'm married to a psychotherapist. I almost married. And they didn't know each other. Those are separate parts of my life. Her father, the one I almost married, was a pediatrician. My wife's father was a pediatrician. Her wife's pediatric father was the head of pediatrics at something known as Philadelphia Children's Hospital. It's a major hospital in Philadelphia. My father-in-law was the head of the pediatrics department at the Albert Einstein Medical School here in New York. And they didn't know each other. The fathers didn't, the children didn't. So something in me went towards young women who had that in their head, all of that. And my wife has been my tutor in psychology ever since. My father read Freud. My father was a serious intellectual. I mean, he read and he thought. He read Freud, and he found it wonderful and fascinating. But the idea of applying it to his own family, I don't think ever occurred to him. When psychological issues came up about people we knew, it was handled with dismissive humor. Ha 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 ha, a shrink. Not. Whereas when he would talk about Freud, it was always serious. And the first time I picked up, and this was in graduate school, I picked up Freud's The Analysis of Dreams, the first major book he wrote. And I realized why this was so important to my father, and then to me as well. I called him and I talked to him, and we had understood why this was important. But for me, it had to be applied to me. For my father, it didn't occur to him. Strange. Anyway, my recent article, why is it all relevant? My recent article was an attempt to do for the here and now everything I've just said to you. It was to demonstrate what I believe, which is that a fundamental shaper, not the only one, and not the most important, I don't believe in any of that, because of Freud, who critiques determinisms in a way I found spectacular, and I've used ever since. But a fundamental omitted, neglect, like economics at Harvard, a fundamental determinant of the malaise of our society, not understood and not admitted or recognized, is to the degree to which the American working class now is shaped by the changing world economy. I draw those lines. I make that argument. I'll send it to you. Very well received. They've gotten an army, a flood of emails from all over the world about it. So it's working. Better response than I've gotten for other articles I've written. The empire, to be blunt, the American empire is now over.
And
And
it doesn't feel over.
yes, I know. The powers of people who have lived through the decline of empires to not see the decline of their empire is stunning. If you want the greatest example now, just go to England. They still haven't figured it out, half of them, that empire is over. even though literally it's gone. All that's left is to send the children of the king or queen periodically to a place like, I don't know, Kenya, and have them hand out British flags to little children who give them bouquets, and then they leave. That's it. That's what's left. The shell of a performance that nobody takes seriously. Anyway, the American empire is over. I'll be glad to explain to you how and why that is. The American empire is founded on an American capitalism that is in a new declining phase. And here's my argument. It is shaping the consciousness of the American people. Everyone in different ways. And it is having, and here you can see my own personal history, it is having double the effect because it can't be spoken. Every psychologist will tell you, a trauma is a bad thing to have in your life. A trauma that you cannot talk about, much worse. Right? The worst examples, childhood sexual trauma or any of those. The only hope to ameliorate it, to soften its impact, is have it talk about it. Talk about it with your parents, talk about it with a relative, talk about it with a psychologist, talk about it with a therapist. You've got to get, sooner or later, or to say the same thing in another aphorism that psychologists like, you want to get over it, the only way over it is to go through it. You have to do that, which is painful and difficult, makes people shy away, but it's... Anyway, that's my argument. My argument is that whether you're trying to understand Trumpism or MAGAism or you name it, that's what you're looking at. You're looking at the working class coming to terms slowly, painfully, with as much resistance as they can muster to facing this. They don't want to see it. Look, part of me empathizes. I mean, who wants to be, I'm in the middle of a declining empire. You don't want this. You want people who will distract you from that, because it's a nagging worry already in the back of your mind. You have occasional dreams about it. You have occasional moments when something, a story on the newspaper, the image flashing across your internet screen, that might be going on. I mean, I can give you so many examples, but no way to start. The war in Ukraine is lost. In America, not yet. It's lost. In America, not yet. Literally, I watched the New York Times or the Washington Post, let alone lesser papers, to take an example from right now. The losing army, desperate to hold on to whatever support it can get from the West, takes a group of its military, which it has a shortage of, and makes a break into an undefended part of Russia. Kursk, if you're following. That's pointless. It's hopeless. Has nothing to do with war. The desperation is written all over it. It'll be over in 2 weeks. But the Ukrainians are showing. What are you doing? Are you crazy? Now, I read French and German newspapers. I have an advantage. With the internet, I can read in my own other languages as easy as I can pick up an American paper. They don't make that mistake. So I have a whole nother network of sources. They make mistakes too. It's not that. But I'm not. Look, here it is. The level of propaganda is horrific. But people should remember, propaganda, like everything else, rises and falls. You need propaganda. In the middle of a war, you need to mobilize your people, so the enemy is an awful, horrible monster beast, and you are beautiful vanilla. I get that. But we all get it, right? We understand in a war you have to kind of, we're all together. So we don't expect all that much. But there's a pattern to propaganda, which the literature on this subject has made very clear. And one of the key sources of propaganda is weakness, is you're losing the situation, and you comfort yourself, just like eating too much or 100 other ways that we comfort ourselves if we're under too much stress. For a country that had 75, maybe 100 years of global dominance, certainly since the Second World War, but even earlier, but certainly since the, so that's a long, that's 75 years roughly, right? So total dominance. I mean, nobody was close. I explained to people, because I'm an economist, the Soviet Union was never an economic competitor of the United States. I give them a statistic. I'll give it to you now, because Americans don't know, because they could find it out in 2 seconds. What is a GDP? You know, the GDP gross, right? It's a rough economics measure of the size of an economy, the footprint, the total output of goods and services in a calendar year. So the GDP of the United States right now, $24 trillion. The GDP of Russia right now, $1.5 trillion. Do you understand? To think of the Soviet Union as an economic competitor means you're ignorant. It's as gross as saying you and that very little midget dwarf person who got stunted by something, who's only 3 feet tall, are no different. What? You're no different. Stop. Whatever else are you, he could be brilliant or she could be, but there's a difference, not in the United States, mentality can't handle it. China is the new empire. I mean, that's it. It's over. It's been over for 10, 15 years, and it becomes more over every minute. It's a phenomenon that is in no way hidden and in no way difficult to discern. Give you an example. This year, like every one of the last 30, the GDP is growing faster in China than here, usually double or triple. This year, the United States will grow 2.5%. China will grow 5%. That's the normal relationship. It's been going on for a generation. I mean, it's over. It's just over. There is a question. The Chinese say they don't want an empire. Now, on the one hand, that could be unbelievable wisdom. Could be. Especially in China, because they had an empire once. They actually are looking at the second time. The United States never had that as a new situation. They want a multipolar world. Xi Jinping says it. He says it repeatedly. And he doesn't say it with a twinkle in his eye. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but maybe we're on the cusp of a different way of organizing the world. We don't have the American Empire, the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, Persian Empire, Greek Empire, Roman Empire. Maybe not, but the American Empire is over. And there's no precedent here. Nobody has prepared the American people. What do you do if the ride up, which was a good ride for 75 years, rising standard of living, people like me went to Harvard, people like you go to Stanford, blah, blah. I mean, I don't know your background, but whatever it is, all of these things are now. And it comes from the change in the world economy. The G7, you know the G7, okay? The G7, US and its major allies, is now a smaller aggregate GDP than the BRICS, China and its allies.
And which are the BRICS for our listeners who don't know?
Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. That's the original BRICS, they're 20 years old. And they have recently been joined by 6 other countries, including Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and some others. And there are about a dozen that have applied, more or less. So the BRICS is already aggregate GDP larger than the G7. You know, why is this important? Because every country's leaders, whether they are right-wing, left-wing, They're all readjusting to what? To the changing world economy. If you're a small African country and you need to build a railroad, it used to mean you would go to London, New York, Paris, and hope and ask and see if they'll bring their bankers to meet with you and you could arrange a loan to develop your country. If you're having trouble selling your products, where would you go? If you have your trouble buying, where would you? Now everybody has a second option. You don't have to go west, you go east. Go to New Delhi, go to Beijing. Why? They have more money. It's not, it doesn't have nothing, I'm exaggerating, but it doesn't have much to do with ideology. So, but not much. It has to do with a changing world economy. And even if you're a partisan of one or the other, you don't want to be left out of, you know. Emmanuel Macron, the leader currently of France, who's on his way out today, his people have rejected him totally. But before that happened, he made noises he wanted to join the BRICS. They turned him down, by the way. They don't need him. That's the Americans don't get it. Look, when the war in Ukraine breaks out, the Russians invade Ukraine, the United States decides that the way to handle this, to defeat the Russians quickly, is by imposing on them the mother of all sanctions. We won't buy Russian oil and gas. Russia depends heavily on oil and gas, which it has a lot of, and exporting it to Europe, which is a consumer and doesn't have much. Perfect relationship. By the way, if you understand modern Europe, it's the core of modern Europe's economic success. Cheap Russian energy. And that flows directly, until they blow up the pipeline, to Germany. Okay. So Germany becomes, in German, you know a little German with your philosophy?
A little bit.
Okay. So Germany has, after the war, which decimates it, a Wirtschaftswunder, which is German for miracle of economics, the recovery of Germany. Germany becomes the economic powerhouse of Europe. Okay, a lot of truth to that, but a dependence on cheap Russian oil and gas. Okay, so the plan is we won't buy it anymore from you. You'll collapse. The ruble will collapse. Your country will fall apart. Not only will you lose the war in Ukraine, but the West will come and carve you up into Moldavias, dozens of them, which could never be any more important than what we call those Kazakhstan, those countries. That's serious. Biden speaks that way. Blinken, the state secretary, speaks that way. Jake Sullivan, the security advisor, they all speak that way. They believed that. That was all wrong. Russia didn't collapse. The ruble is fine. Yeah. What happened? They didn't understand the change in the world because they're lost in the make-believe that it's not over. They didn't understand BRICS. What did the Russians do? They went to their allies, Russia and China. Will you buy the oil that we can't sell to Europe? Done. Deal. No problem. Game over. Now, why did you say to yourself, as historians will, they couldn't see this coming? They don't know what you know? Of course they know. But it's like Harvard when I was a student. You don't want to see that. That's not cool. Nobody wants to hear the leader of our country saying, "Ooh, the empire's over." My agenda is to work out a way to decline that preserves the things we care about. I use the following example. When the United States, as a corner colony of Britain, decides it wants to do things its own way, okay? The British come down and say, you can't. And the Americans, half of them take it, the other half are pissed off. So we have the Tea Party in Boston. I mean, exaggerating, simplifying. So then we have a war. But it's very important. The British go to war against the United States, their own colony, to say to the colony, you are not going to go your own way. You're going to do what we tell you. George III, king, sits in England, and George Washington sits here. And the British, to everybody's amazement, including George Washington's, lose the war. 1812, they try again. They fail again. And they reach a conclusion. We can't prevent it. And so they work out a live and let live deal with their colony. Even though they're competitors in many ways, we can work something out, and they do. That will become the American strategy toward China. But it's not speakable yet. And you know, the first politician who says it, and says it clearly, will be the next president, because it'll be understood, however bitterly, as the best way to go, as it was in England. They didn't like it, they hated it, they bemoaned it, then they did it. And this country will too, because what the fuck is the alternative? Nuclear war? Really? You want to do that? Endless of these proxy wars? And by that I include the one in the Middle East, about to explode. Absurd games in the South China Sea around Taiwan. So I think all of these are, to bring it back, consequences flowing out of a change world economic arrangement, which can be summarized in a lot of ways: the arrival of the BRICS, the emergence of China, the decline of the American empire. There are a lot of different ways of categorizing or characterizing what's going on, just as there are many ways in which it shapes the American consciousness. I think Americans are very distressed. They get it. There's a reason why MAGA is the slogan. Why? Make America great. They know that there was something lost. And you know, glib comments. Oh, people always think, you know, it's greener on the other side, it's greener in the pear. Yeah, it is a little bit automatic, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. That doesn't mean you're done with your analysis when you can show people are grabbing onto some manner of speaking. They're also expressing something running real deep in them, that they know. You know, the war in Vietnam, forget everything else. It was lost. We lost. The war in Iraq, we lost. The war in Afghanistan, we lost. The war in Ukraine, we lost. Holy mackerel, what is that? That's what happens with empires when they overreach. They can't do it. You know, if you go back and you read Gibbon or anybody else on the decline of the Roman Empire, it was these what did they call them? Vandals, barbarians coming from the Central European steppes that were, you know, ripping apart the Roman Empire. Well, it doesn't take a genius. There were plenty who did good work there, but it doesn't really take a genius. The reason the foreigner can grab your stuff is because you can't stop them. Come on. We sent 500,000 people to Vietnam. We lost. It's a communist country. The Taliban runs Afghanistan. I mean, what, you need more information? And yet, when I give speeches in the United States, and I do this on purpose, and I reach a certain point, I have a pregnant pause, I lean over the podium, and then I say, and then the war in Vietnam was lost. The United States was beaten. You should see the faces. I wish I had a camera, capture my audience. They don't know what to do. By that time, I made a decent impression. I'm a bit of a stand-up comedian. I make jokes. I try to make the lecture. It's American audience. They used to TV, so I try to be entertaining. But at that moment, I catch them. It's not that they don't agree, although many don't. But it's not that. It's just there's something shockingly. I use a sexual metaphor. It's not that we don't know what's behind the clothing. But when a person takes their clothing off, there's a moment of sort of shock, because we've all grown up in a society that says that's not the way it's supposed to be. It's not the appropriate thing. You're supposed to have a top and a bottom, particularly the bottom, and then we're not supposed to see. We all know what's there. Half of us because it's what we got, and the other half because we've been interested in what the other one got, and we have figured it out. So what is this all about? That's what this is. This is, we kind of know. We kind of know the empires. We kind of know, but we don't. We do not want to hear it. In a way, I think, if I can push it a little, that Trump was the first to cash in on this. There's something terribly wrong in this country, and I'm not like the others who pretend it isn't there. I'm not Bush, the Republican. I'm not Clinton. Everything's okay, and we're going to be all right, and everything is good. I'm not that. I'm going to say naughty things. I'm going to, Mexicans, who want Mexicans? They're all rapists. I mean, inappropriate things, stupid, inappropriate, ignorant, biased. And by that act, he becomes one of the people who've been saying such things at the bar for years and over the dining room table in their family and at the workplace, and angry that the politicians can't or won't admit it, even though they're afraid to say so. I think they loved him for that. Many still do. But you know something? That goes nowhere. Never did. And so they don't want that anymore. They're enough with that. And the poor Trump, he's going right down the tubes now because he's stuck with the persona that had its moment, but is now, it's over. It doesn't compute. It doesn't do. People are really frightened more and more. They want a cheery person. They got one. And they're going to go for her because she's cheery. She's happy. She's energetic. This image of the two old men, in a race to see whose cognitive decline will be quicker, was just the worst. That's the image of the empire. Those two old men having trouble walking up an incline. Jesus Christ, this is it. She's brown and she's going to do it. And he's a nice guy with a nice smile, coaches football, teaches, likes working people. This is much better. By the way, this will wear out just as fast as MAGA. And then, I hope, somebody will come along and say, hey, we need to make a deal between the rich and the poor. And they both are going to have to, we're going to ease the pain. What we've had if I were writing the speech, what we've had so far is we've had the rich and the powerful in a declining empire using their wealth and power to hold on to what they got. And you know what that means? They're offloading the cost of a declining empire on the middle and lower classes. That can't go on. I'm the champion. But I'm saying to the rich and powerful, we're going to take a chunk of what you got. But if we don't, then everything will be lost. And they'll buy it, because they'll be by that time frightened by enough Ukrainians that they'll buy it. Or they won't. And if they won't, then they'll have to have a straight-out fascist to hold on to the middle and the bottom. And that's over then, too, which kind of they also know. So they're in a very tough place. I won't be around to see it. You will. But it's a tough place.
Okay, let me give you a break. There are, again, a number now of regions and topics to discuss. But I'd actually like to talk about America in a context that hasn't come up yet. And it has come up to the extent that we discussed your global background and the indirect ways in which the Holocaust affected your life. And I guess the reason that this stuck out to me is that I also recently spoke with Norman Finkelstein again, who's another historian, though he isn't as focused on economic dimensions to history recently, and his entire family was decimated by the Holocaust as well. And it's interesting that he's Jewish and people don't, or a lot of people don't believe that it is consistent for Jews to be in support of Palestine.
Right.
But one dimension about the American empire and the dying American empire that I'd like to talk about or hear your thoughts on is our role in Israel and why we are so desperately clinging to this alliance and what the Middle East means to us going forward.
I want to try to answer it by being philosophically and historically sensitive to the issue. The United States projects onto Israel its own situation, and vice versa. Now, we all do that. I mean, projection, if you study psychology, you know, is a major thing. We can see in others what we often cannot see in ourselves, and we begin to try to work on problems we have by working on them when we notice them in other people. And then it often comes as a shock when the other people say, after a certain difficult moment, you're projecting. In other words, throwing it back on you. So let me explain. Israel can only exist in the long run, I suspect, and I know they suspect it too, by eliminating the Palestinians, either physically, which is a horrible thought for people who were victims of genocide to become perpetrators of it, that even for the right-wingers there who talk like that, must be some difficulty there somewhere. Or by pushing them out, or by expelling them so they go to Egypt or Syria or Lebanon or somewhere else. And that means for them, the United States, and people have to face this even though it's hard, is a model. We did it. We Americans did it. What's left of the indigenous population here? We killed them almost all. And the few that remain live in horrific conditions in what we call reservations scattered across the country. There's hardly anything left of the culture, languages. I know they preserve them, they try hard, but you know, for most people the word Navajo means turquoise jewelry, if it means anything at all. So we're the model. If the Israelis weren't afraid of what it would sound like and what it might do to their support here, they would say that. They would say, who are you? You Americans are telling us we shouldn't do what you did. To which the answer is history. Yeah, we did it at a time when you can get away with that. You can't. So, I mean, it's useless as a model. It's not doable at this point. And now vice versa. Israel is a model for the United States. What is it doing? It's trying to hold on to a colonial situation. The epithet that many use against Israel, that you are an example of settler colonialism, that's correct. That's right, they are. They're not different in that way from Rhodesia or South Africa. And what happened to all of them? Whoops. Israel is arguably one of the last remaining settler colonialisms where the fight is still going on between the settlers and the people they displaced. The first book I wrote, published by Yale University Press, was a book version of my doctoral dissertation, which was a study of settler colonialism in the East African country of Kenya. It's now a standard, but if you're going to do an economic history of Kenya, and my book is among those you'd look at. I went to Kenya. I went to the British Museum where the data were. And I'm a good economist. A lot of data, full of tables in there. I mean, I did the work. But it's over. You know, the Mau Mau rebellion in the 50s effectively ended settler colonialism. The United States sees itself in Israel.
Richard, before we go on, just because it is such a contested issue, and I don't want to get totally derailed with it, but since you're an expert on it, I feel that I ought to ask just why you think of Israel as a colonialist state, because there is facially this argument that it once belonged to them and to Jews, and they're returning. So how do you respond to, I mean, there are many vocal people who disagree with this view.
Yes, I understand, absolutely. But you know, the Bible is a collection of stories that people wrote at various times and then made into a holy book. A lot of religions do that. They have books and people write them and then they ennoble them. You know, there's the Quran and the Bible, and there's a lot of others. And I understand people can kill each other over the contents or interpretations of the books. But the human race has been all over the place all the time. Everybody can go anywhere and call it the right of return. Come on, I mean, what? There's a dispute over who the indigenous people were in what we now call the Western Hemisphere. There's an argument, for example, that at one time there was a land bridge linking what is now Alaska with Russia, and on the other side of the Bering Sea up there. Okay, on that theory, which has lots of support, we are all Asians. Till the Chinese arrive and say, hey, this is all, we're coming back. We shouldn't have gone across there. We were hounded by evil. Stop. I mean, yes. Is there a story to be told here? Yes. This was once peopled by. But are you going to kill each other over real estate? Really? Stop. We're talking about the planet, people who have moved around the planet. We are all one theory in anthropology is we're all descended from what would have been a black female skeleton, I believe, found in Kenya by Leakey and the people that worked with him who unearthed all these things. So we're all Africans? What? I mean, at some arbitrary point, you say, okay, I'm not going to anymore deal with movement. I'm going to start there. They were there then. Yeah, but they weren't always there then. They were somewhere else. And if you want to start at the beginning, then we're all Africans, which all these people will agree, oh, I don't want to do that. So I find all of this understandably, desperately trying to rationalize a difficult situation. The missionaries who came to Africa believed, and I think sincerely, that they were bringing wisdom, religion, salvation, and modernity to backward people, doing them an immense service, allowing them to leap over transitional periods that would have been difficult and painful at best. I understand it. But I also understand what the word rationalization has come to mean in psychology and in history. And I think it is, here's where I get bitter. I think it's criminal to cover over some, to make it crystal clear. I found it horrible what Hamas did on October 7th. Horrible, horrible. I put it in the context of a long struggle. I remember, because I've been interested, that every war that Israel fought until now was short and justified on the grounds that that's the way we protect against a horrible thing happening to us. And I began thinking by the 1970s, after the 67 war, that this argument didn't look too good because it wasn't protecting against horrific continuing acts. October 7th is the culmination of that thought in my mind. If ever you wanted a demonstration that all of the previous time, I don't know if you're familiar, but with the earlier, shorter wars, the Israelis would proudly say toward the end or at the end, X number of Israelis were killed, and X multiplied by 10 or 20 or 30 was the number of them that we killed. And when we're told, gee, that's nothing to be proud of, we were told, that's to make sure it doesn't happen again. You know, it's like the United States dropping nuclear bombs in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Why? To save lives. Lives would have been cost if we had to invade, so now we didn't have to invade, we dropped the bomb. And yes, they're horrible, but much less than this kind of logic. Okay, for me, that's what all of this is about. October 7th is a horrible slaughter to be condemned as such, but it is also the proof, and it should be recognized, that this plan, which they're now continuing, is a very bad plan. It doesn't work. History doesn't work like that. You don't do it. That's make-believe. That's like saying, umpteen generations ago, there was these two guys that were living here, so I'm coming back. I mean, I get it. I understand. This is a game. Like, this will prevent more violence in the future. Or the Americans, who have 800 bases right now around the world. No other country has anything like that. We have 800 bases around the world, and the rationale, if we don't fight them over there, we'll be fighting them over here. Okay, this is the same thing. Again, it doesn't work like that. Believe me, if and when the shit happens here, all of that argument will stop being made because it will be shown what it is. So for me, I think what the Israel has done since is, like most people in the world, horrific. I mean, Americans, again, seem to have the ability, after the UN says this is a genocidal situation, to believe that this is all, no, you have to pay attention to this. Okay, don't pay attention. Doesn't go away because a 3-year-old child confronted by a scary dog puts his hands in front of his eyes because he believes that if he can't see the dog, it's not there. Then, as the child grows older, he realizes, you do this, the dog's still there. We can pretend, but the rest of the world, and if Israel takes the next step with the United States, without it, with Britain and France, without them, and goes to war with Iran, they're going to make an unbelievable mistake. I don't know whether you and I will be able to have conversations after such a mistake. But yeah, I understand the argument, but for me, this is a classic example of ex post rationalization, trying to find in a difficult situation. And I'm a Hegelian again in that way. I think when people tell that story, biblically, who were here once, it's because it's where they do recognize they've got a problem. They were put there, and the Palestinians were kicked out. And the British said, go ahead and do this, who had no authority or right to do it. So the British and the Zionists got together, did this thing at the expense of the Palestinians. Everybody knows that. And you can tell whatever story. That's what happened. And I think that the Israelis, I want to give them credit, even if they don't want it. I think they know that. And I think they're needy of it. Just like the Trump supporters, there's an empathy I have for them. They're suffering. Who wants to go backwards? They know somewhere What are you talking? Backward? You really want to be like your grandpa? You don't. You want to go back, but you don't really. You don't want to go back very far. And they know they're not stupid, not at all. So that what this is a little compromise people make with themselves that a clever politician or an instinctual one can play on. That's what this is.
Focusing on the economic undercurrents that you said motivate and inform both your understanding of history and current events, I'm curious about the role specifically of this particular region of Israel and Palestine, and then the larger Middle East, and how this functions in this conflict between G7 and BRICS and the loss of the American empire to China.
Yeah, well, I think you're seeing a coming together in the Middle East of a number of things. The first and most important, in my opinion, is the end of colonialism. That's bigger than the end of the United States because it's the end of the British and the French, the German. They all had empires, many of them with outposts in the Middle East. If you look at the history, France, key in Syria, Lebanon, Germany, and Turkey, and other places, Britain everywhere. And then all of them wiped out in the Second World War heavily and replaced by the United States, which become. The others are still there, but replaced by the United States. So that area of the world is part of a revolution that really starts in the first half of the 20th century and then really takes off in the second half and continuing. And that is a rejection of being a colonial subordinate. Not finished, not by a long shot. One big struggle happened in the first half of the 20th century when they kind of got themselves together and I'm exaggerating, but simplify. The people there understood they're going to have a big fight to get out of this. Second half, they took the first big step, political independence. Now, in the 21st century, they're dealing with the economic independence, which they do not have. And they're bitter. Bitter because many of them didn't understand that political independence doesn't go within in other words, no necessary. You can be as dependent economically after independence as you were before. Political independence, parliamentary government is a bit of a mirage. They weren't leftist enough. If they had been more leftist, they would have understood that the corporations can buy the political system if they need to and want to, and that can render the government a shell, a front, puppets, sort of like we have here. You know, if you look, the best example I can think of, if you look at a number of major issues that the Gallup or other polling companies regularly monitor, overwhelming majorities believe what the Congress does not do. Majority of people don't want the Ukraine more, don't want to spend all that money. Probably by now a majority don't want to support Israel, or certainly a large number don't. And a huge majority, because this I study, are in favor of a less unequal United States. They would like there to be a smaller gap between rich, much smaller than there is, and on and on and on. Majority want a higher minimum wage. A majority. They don't get any of it. And they know that. And they're angry with Republicans. You didn't do what you promised, and they vote Democrat. Then they get angry at the Democrats. You didn't do what you promised. It's all true. They promised it, and they didn't do it. And the interesting thing is that the reality is that political independence is a shell if you don't have economic independence. Or to say the same thing domestically, political democracy is a veneer if you don't have economic democracy, and we don't. Every business in this country, with very few exceptions, every factory, every office, every store, has a tiny group of people at the top who have all the power. The board in a corporation or a major form of business, a corporate board of directors, typically 15 people, between 10 and 20, but 15, good average. But they decide what to produce, how to produce, what technology to use, where to do it, and what to do with the revenue. The rest of us are employees. We make none of those decisions, nor do we have any power to decide who makes them. The shareholders do that. Shareholders are not employees, and vice versa. So we don't have a democratic system, and therefore that pollutes or undermines the claim to democracy. So when Kamala Harris gets up there, or any of the others, and they're preserving democracy, the only thing one can do is grin. You are doing a magic trick. You are preserving something that isn't there. Okay. Anyway, the problem, therefore, the first problem for the Middle East is that they don't have economic independence, nothing remotely like it. The only country with a little bit of exception to that, just a little, is Israel. Why? Because of their peculiar relationship, A, to Jews and B, to the United States, which gives them a whole lot of money for nothing, just out of a kind of solidarity. You are our baby. You are our friend. You are our fellow Jew. You are our whatever, however they conceptualize it. There's a load of opportunity, cash, business deals, all kinds of things that are available to them through that contact that are not available yet to the others. BRICS may equal that game. That is, BRICS may, not yet clear, become a source of that kind of support either for selected other countries in the Middle East, which is already beginning to be the case. For example, Iran, which is why for Israel this is such a problem. Iran has, by being a BRICS member now, but also by dint of a very carefully followed policy, has now built relationships between itself, Russia, its neighbor, and China that you can see. The U.S. attempt to smash Russia is defeated by BRICS. That's that sanction story I told you. And Iran will see if Israel and Iran now enter into a war, what kind of support Russia and China will give. My guess is it will surprise everybody, just the way the support for Ukraine, for Russia in the Ukraine war has surprised everybody. But for the moment, the Middle East is in a terrible place because they have political independence. They do not have economic dependence, which means they're either terribly poor and dependent on very few resources, or they have oil, which means they're dependent on that. And they're dependent on a global oil system that they cannot control. They're much too small. The only one who can do that a little is Saudi Arabia, and it doesn't want to share that position. The overcoming of the fight between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which was achieved by the Chinese, important hint, that changes the equation because that gives it the chance for a unity. The chance, no guarantee, the chance for a unity across what was a very divisive thing, because, you know, that's not just the unity of two major countries, and it's not just the unity of two major oil producers. It is the unity of Sunni and Shia within the Muslim. very, 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 very important that the Chinese did that and that they understood all that should be an enormous message to the West. Completely blew right by. The need in this country not to see what was achieved. And now, to be fair, most of what Iran has done has been the consequence of American policy. I think the Iranians would have been willing to cut deals with the United States. The Americans lost the opportunity. They didn't. When Trump canceled the arrangement with Iran early in his thing, that was a terrible misjudgment, and that has been kept going. That I just recently read a very nice article, very well done. You know who Zbigniew Brzezinski was? The advisor to Bush and the others. Big Polish, but American, big anti-Soviet. His whole thing before he died was the importance of the United States making an arrangement with Iran. And his great enemy were the neocons who wanted to destroy Iran. And that he died having lost that battle. The neocons have been in charge, and they have, and that drove Iran into where it is, as it did with Russia and China, bringing them together. Very, very, very dangerous for the United States. So anyway, you have the interaction of not wanting to be a colony, then the interaction of wanting desperately to find a solution to their economic dependence, now being offered a place in the BRICS. The Israelis unable or unwilling to try to find a place for themselves in the BRICS means that they're on the edge or out of it altogether. That's a whole new situation, because before, Israel was alone with a patron, the U.S. None of those countries had a comparable patron. Even if you had a patron of Russia, which they didn't, but even if you had it, remember what I told you. Russia is this economically, the United States is this. If you remember those numbers, Russia with a 1.5 trillion, United States with 23. Well, what's the GDP of China? 17, 18 trillion. So they are in the running, and they're getting closer every day. Russia's not. And with Russia and China together and Iran, then you have them as the patron. That's part of what this war is about. That patron is becoming important for all the smaller countries. They all, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, they're looking and they're seeing Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia are now with Russia. They know where their future is. Right there it is, right in front of you. You have to come to, and they're doing it. They're applying. They want to get in there. That's leaving Israel more and more. And the last thing is that the greatest representative of the colonial master isn't the old empires. Those have been defeated. They all got independence. It's the new one, the economic monster from which we did not get independence, which is global capitalism, which is represented, or was, by the United States. So Israel is the United States for them. And by the United States making Israel its partner, or whatever the language is, you are telling the Muslim world, if you hate Israel for all the religious reasons or the Palestine story or whatever, then the United States that's them. You know, Israel is the 51st state, or however they talk about it. It's a kind of every time Mr. Biden gets up and says, we will be with Israel all along, it's one more nail in the coffin, man. It does not, you have to be blind not to understand. And that's true not just in the Middle East, but in the whole Muslim world. That goes to Indonesia, Pakistan, or any of the other major Muslim countries, not to speak of Africa, or the growth of Islam in Latin America, all of which are significant. There's a level here. Here's the irony. The United States, after World War II, developed a commitment to things that were either called containment or some other kind of policy to isolate Russia, Soviet Union, or to Eastern Europe, or now to isolate. You know who's getting isolated? We are. It's the person who's busy painting everything in their environment, and then they end up in that, like in the cartoon, they've painted themselves into a corner. We're not isolating others, you stupid fuck. We're isolating us. That's come on, it's the Hegelian moment. You recognize always the other lurking. The boundary of whatever it is what separates you from the other. And the boundary being on both means the other is with you through the how hard is that? But we don't teach Hegel in the United States. By the way, there was no course on Hegel at Harvard.
Not at Stanford either, really.
No. The only place when I was interested in really doing this were Catholic schools. The Catholic schools in America had courses on Hegel. I think because they took philosophy, if you're going to read, I don't know, Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine or all the other greats of that tradition, you realize they were the big people for Hegel and Kant and Fichte and Schelling and all the rest, and now you understand. Anyway, no Hegel. It's either right or wrong. It cannot be both.
You used this word blinded with great vigor a couple of minutes ago, and I don't think that I am blinded to this particular conflict as much as I am just woefully ignorant. And the one that I have in mind is that between Ukraine and Russia. There is so much to study, so much to read about, and it's just one that I haven't spent much time with. But I did see the headlines this weekend that you referenced earlier, that Ukraine has made this valiant incursion into Russian territory. And as somebody who is woefully uninformed, you labeled this as propaganda. It didn't occur to me that it was propaganda. I just sort of tacitly assumed, oh, it's the news. Ukraine is about to win this war and somehow Russia is on its heels. Yeah. And so let me just ask if you could, I found that answer about Israel's role in this dispute between the G7 and the BRICS very helpful. What is Ukraine's role in this dispute between the G7 and BRICS, and what's going on with this conflict right now, and why are people thinking or saying that Ukraine is winning now?
Okay. Some great journalist, I think it was, made a crack, which has become widely well known. You've probably heard it. And it goes like this. The first casualty in every war is the truth. Wars being what they are have motivated lots of people, not just America, but all kinds of people all around the world, to start telling monstrous make-believe. And again, there are many motivations. No leader of a war wants to be the loser, because that's usually the end of your career. So you got to be the winner. And no one wants to hear about the lost battles. They want to hear about the valiant achievements. And that's usually on both sides. So you really should be, deeply skeptical of anything that sounds like an official assessment of something in a war, unless it is so lopsided, the war, that one side doesn't need it, doesn't need the public. It's not that they wouldn't do it. It's not that they haven't done it, but they don't need it this time. Anyway, in this case, I think you have a little bit of the propaganda on both sides, a bit more on the Ukraine than on the Russian. But that you have to treat it all with a good bit of skepticism would be strange not to. On the other hand, it's not symmetric. Ukraine, again, is a little country. Russia is an enormous... The gap between Russia and Ukraine is as big that way as the one I told you about before between Russia and the United States. So you're looking at a colossus fighting a mouse, okay? So forget everything you know. The chances of the mouse winning, very slim. Everybody who pays attention knows that. Okay, the inequality is reduced when the West decides it's going to support this Ukraine. That was decided politically 10 years ago, in 2014. There was a government. When the Cold War ends, all the Eastern European countries that were allied with Russia, from Poland in the north to Bulgaria in the south, became, quote unquote, fully independent. They were no longer dependent on the Soviet Union, because one there. So all of their governments collapsed and were replaced by more or less right-wing governments. There were some exceptions, but basically it's a story. Ukraine among them. Took a little longer. Ukraine for a while had a leader who was very pro-Russian, openly so. He was overthrown. The Americans were involved in that, as they were in many of these. How important were they? Sometimes a lot, sometimes not so much. Ukraine quite a bit, but I don't think all of that is all that crucial. The big issue was, would these countries be independent? You know, like Switzerland, like Austria, sort of. Or would they be like the rest of Western Europe? And now here comes the dispute. The Russians claim, and they have good evidence, that they were promised, as part of the whole deal of all of that, that NATO, the anti-Russian organization of Western Europe and America, would not expand eastward. They would not try to bring in all of those countries from Poland in the north, Bulgaria in the south. And the Russians would therefore let Eastern Europe go. Now, you could ask the question, perfectly reasonable. Could the Russians have stopped it in any case? Probably not. So there's a little bit, you know, okay, but the promises were apparently made by a whole host of American and British diplomats, politicians, from the very top. And then in the years that followed, remember we're talking about stuff that happens in the early 1990s. In the years that followed, NATO did exactly what the claim is they promised not to do. Poland became part of NATO. They all, the Baltic states, all of them became part of NATO. So if the NATO alliance moved across, and remember what that, I keep saying remember, you're young, maybe that's the wrong word. Those countries, that cordon from Poland in the north to Bulgaria in the south, that's a buffer zone. That's a group of countries with populations and geography separating Russia from Western Europe. And therefore no military could come across there without the Russians having ample time and space and distance to protect themselves. And Russia has been invaded, repeated, right? Napoleon invaded Russia, World War I they invaded Russia, World War II Hitler invaded Russia. Worrying about invasions from Western Europe is a reasonable position for them to have. You may not like it, you may not agree with it, but given their history, wow. So they wanted that. So they're giving that up. Okay. May have happened anyway, but they're giving it up. So they lost that. And Mr. Putin, first it was Yeltsin and a couple of the other clowns they had there, that Mr. Putin is sitting there trying to be the president of a country going through unspeakable difficulty. The collapse of their system would have been difficult for everybody, but they were also trying to reconstruct an economy. Very, very difficult. So he discovers he's the president. He's doing a passable job of recrafting an economy, but he looks like a weakling. I mean, all those countries are joining NATO, and he can't do anything. He can't stop it. He complains about it. He says, you're violating, we will not let you continue doing this. But it looks for all the world like he's a tin pot dictator telling you, I can't do it. But we did it, and you didn't do shit. Nothing. The last one left was Ukraine. And Ukraine had been more integrated into Russia. The others were more, Poland is its own thing, and Romania is its own thing. Romania has a Romance language. It doesn't have a Slavic language, stuff like that. Ukraine that's them. If you went to the most famous restaurant in New York City, serving Russian food for the last century, it's been called it's still there, the Russian Tea Room. It's right next door to Carnegie Hall on 57th Street.
Is it good?
What?
Is it good?
If you like Russian food, I'm French. Our standards are very high.
Yeah.
Anyway, if you like Russian food, you can still go there. Okay, the most, if not the most famous dish, one of the two great dishes is called chicken Kiev. It's a particular way of preparing chicken, as was originally done in the Ukrainian city capital of Kiev. The Russian Tea Room featured that because that's as Russian as it gets. It's just so you understand. So for them to start saying, as they did, after they took all the other countries, we are now next going to go after Ukraine. And remember, they also tried 10 years ago to get a hold of Georgia, the state of Georgia, where Stalin came from, in the south of Russia there. That didn't work either. The Russian army came in and doing that. So it was clear that now the Russians were stiffening. You've taken all of that, but you're not going to come in and take what were literally parts of Russia. Georgia was a republic within the USSR, as Ukraine was. In the Russian Revolution, all of these places were given the status of independent republics. That's why it has that name, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That's what USSR stands for. So they were much more integral. So now NATO is beginning to disconnect a piece of Russia from the rest of Russia. And Putin says, and he did it several times, we will not let you do that. You can't do it. And if you do it, remember, he had bullshit that, and it was a cry wolf, he was doing it again. So I understand why the West didn't understand that he meant it. So they have it's a long story, but they got rid of the pro-Russian government here. They had a Maidan revolution. They had 2 or 3 people wanting to be, there was a comedian, a popular comedian in Ukraine named Zelensky.
I've heard that name.
Yes. And they chose him. And the person who chose him was the woman in the State Department, forget her name right now, who quit recently because she's so upset about how it's going. But she brought Zelensky in. There's a cable that got quoted in WikiLeaks. Bring in the comedian. She had a sense of humor. We're bringing in a comedian. They brought in the comedian. And with good actor, he puts on the valiant struggler leader persona nicely. And they make announcements. They're working to bring Ukraine into NATO, and he says, okay, we're done. 2 days later, they invade. I mean, he had been building troops and moving them to the border, so people knew, the United States knew, weeks, maybe even months, what was going to happen. But they thought it was still bluffing. All right, now he's at the next level of bluff. It isn't just, he's moving the troops, but he moved the troops, and then 2 days after the last time, he did it. Okay, so now what? Now the United States is caught. They have a plan in their hallucination. They're going to carve Russia up. Russia's not going to be the big colossus it used to be. You know, a country that goes from the Pacific Ocean all the way to the North Sea. That's always been the dream. Be very easy to manipulate 20 little republics like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Azerbaijan and Armenia, all of which were republics before. So they want to carve it up into republics and get the more moderate ones say, no, we just want to slap Russia on the wrist. It's easy to do now. All of it was a mistake. They misunderstood the BRICS, misunderstood their own position in the world economy. They don't get it. They still don't. All right, so why do I say what I do? In the opening days of the war, I remembered the slogan, the truth is victimized, fine. So I don't believe anything. But that becomes very difficult. I pick up the same newspapers. I'm an American. I watch TV and all of this. So I say to myself, I've got to find somewhere somebody must be around who's not so far committed to one side or the other that they've lost their ability to do something. And I found it. And I'll be glad to tell you if you're interested.
Of course.
Okay, the man's name is Alexander Mercouris, Greek, Mercouris. Clearly sympathizes with Russia, no question about it. But it's not part of the Russian government, or I don't care, maybe he is. Secretly, I wouldn't know yet. He certainly doesn't say so. He's on every single day for at least an hour. Every day, 7 days a week, and it has been throughout the war to this minute. I listened last night, just so you know. I don't ever do that. I've not been that way for anything. I don't have the time. But I don't catch him every night, but I listen very often. Why? Well, I've now learned. I was very skeptical at first. I wasn't sure what I could trust. His sympathy to the Russians has been fairly clear. But he's good. I think there are moments when I say, no, he hadn't got his. By the way, when he talks about American politics, he's wrong. He makes terrible he doesn't get that. He's based in London, and he's Greek. So I forgive him. When he talks about the United States, it's useless. But when he means well, he likes Trump, by the way, likes Trump. But that's a little bit that Russian business. It's the neocons he hates. He hates them because they really are the enemy for him. And Trump is not them, so he likes Trump. I'm sure he'll adjust if Kamala Harris wins. But he's been reliable. The only reason I mention him is he has been reliable. And he's been reliable in the following sense, not for the details. I don't listen to the detail. He's full of details. It's kind of boring. This is the village that today was taken. The Ukrainians took this village. The Russians took the... I don't know the geography of Ukraine. Even if I knew the geography, I don't know what the meaning is of grabbing. It's like you said, they took White Plains, but not Yonkers. I actually know White Plains and Yonkers, but I wouldn't know what that meant. What I get from him is a sense of how the war is going. And he's been excellent on it. He said when the Ukrainian had a counteroffensive in 2023, he talked about the gains they made and what they did, and what the Russians did wrong. He was able to do that. But he has mostly shown me what I would have understood without knowing anything, which is this is a war between David and Goliath, except David doesn't have a slingshot. And so now his chances with Goliath, he had that slingshot, but without the slingshot, I mean, he's just little David. And then the big Goliath, it ain't gonna go well. And then that was my, but I'm no military strategist, I don't know that. But the economics felt like, I right away could see, whoa, in the early months, when Putin went to India, talked to Modi, and went to China and talked to Xi Jinping, and then I went, because I know how to do that, and I followed the oil and the gas trade. And where are the oil and gas lines being built? They had made a deal. And the deal was to move the oil and gas from Russia, sell it to China and India, and use the money to buy the products from India and China to replace those that they wouldn't buy from the West, because they didn't have the dollars to do it with. And then you saw it, and it all came together. The Chinese have become the manufacturer of the world. And if it's not Chinese, it's Vietnamese or Bangladeshis, or they will sell to Russia. There's no problem. They want that business, they'll sell to Russia. And they make everything. The Russians are not going to be deprived of being unable to trade with Western Europe and America, because this is what Americans don't get. There's nothing made here that they don't make better and cheaper. And I use as an example, I don't know if, here's the economist hat. I'll give you an example. Electric vehicles, electric car, electric truck. The best electric cars and trucks in the world, right now, as we speak, are made in China. It is the world leader in electric cars and trucks. And that's the future of cars and trucks. Okay, the Chinese have the best and the cheapest. Okay, so the whole world is making the transition for reasons of pollution and climate change, but also for reasons of economizing on oil and gas and all of that. They're making the switch. Where are they going to buy it? They're going to buy them in China. Russia can re-equip its entire fleet by buying from China. With what? With the money they get from selling China the oil and gas. It'll run those cars that are still running on oil and gas, plus heat people's homes and make the electricity and all the rest. You can't play the way you did before. Before, the United States, if you go to Cuba, they're driving cars made in the 50s. Cobbled together, cannibalized Jeeps or stuff. Why? Because they can't replace it. But the rest of the world is different. It's like telling Israel, you can't do settler colonialism now. You could do it then, but you can't do it now. So the Chinese, here's the joke. The United States, and it'll tell you a lot if you understand this example. To explain this example, because you might like it for your own purposes. You know that American men are in love with the pickup truck. It's a man. You got to have boots, sort of like those. Well, no, boots, and a cowboy hat and a pickup truck, and you're a real man. Okay. Why is that? Is there something uniquely muscular about a pickup truck? No. Here's the reason. In the 1960s, the American car companies suddenly confronted real competition, which they hadn't for quite a while, mostly because of World War II. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, competition. Where was it coming from? Europe. VW, Peugeot, and Fiat, the producers there. They were coming back from the destruction of World War II, and they all understood they have to beat the United States because we were the hegemon. So they knew they had to produce a car that was better and cheaper. If they could do that, like the VW Bug, then they could break the market, because Americans were producing those boats on wheels, the old Chevy or the old silly car. Anyway, and so they did. And so the American Automobile Company went, bonkers, losing money. A deal was struck. Complicated story, I won't bore you with it. End result of the deal, a tariff. The Europeans accepted a tariff on the truck. 25%, that's a lot in the car business. So any truck coming from Europe, pickup truck, you'd have to pay the price of that truck plus 25 cents to Uncle Sam as a tariff tax in order to bring it in. So they couldn't do it. It meant for the American car companies, which is why they pushed for it, freebie. You could now produce your truck and you could jack up the price by 20%, because that would still be less than they coming in having to pay 25%. But you would keep the profits yourself. So they did. And that's why they advertised trucks as manly symbols to every one of those 19-year-old wannabes who felt much larger and much more attractive to their potential girlfriend by having a truck. It had nothing to do with it. It was a deal. They advertised that because that was where the profit was, in a way that wasn't available on a sedan or a regular truck, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, what was the tariff until 6 months ago? What was the tariff on electric trucks and cars from China? 27.5% more. Biden 6 months ago raised it to 100%. If you go to Europe today, 1/4 of all the electric vehicles on the road in Europe are Chinese. If you
Wow.
Yes. If you go to the United States, not 1/4, zero. We have no China. You can't find. By the way, the biggest Chinese company, I'm going to ask you, you ever heard of it? Who makes cars and trucks? Does it a name like Chevy or Ford?
No.
BYD, 3 initials.
Yeah.
When you're done, look it up. BYD. It's the colossus of China that makes electric vehicles. It's the largest seller of electric vehicles in Europe. It's not Tesla. It's them. They've outdone Tesla. Tesla's in China too, but BYD in China is the core company. Okay, this is a summary of all of what is going on. The United States is thereby, and that's the point, isolating itself. We are the place where there are no cheap electric vehicles. Why? Because we are the sufferers. I'll give you an example. Take a company A that makes whatever it is, shoes or camera equipment, doesn't matter. Any company in the United States making something. Take its competitor in Europe or Asia or Africa, who also makes that thing, and they both try to sell whatever that thing is in the world economy. The American company is going to have to, for reasons of law, and so switch to electric trucks and electric cars for their salespeople and to bring in their inputs, and they're going to have to pay more for the electric. Why? Because American companies are making, they're doing with electric what they did with the pickup truck, charging a very high price. Try to go out and buy an electric car, you'll see. Price very high, unless you have one. You'll see quickly. Prices are high because they're artificially protected by the tariff. But the competitor doesn't have that problem. The European competitor who's making the same watch that you and I are thinking about buying for our boyfriends or girlfriends, we're going to get a better deal from the European because he's got cheaper inputs, like electric or American. So the American company got nothing to do with electric vehicles is going to be hurt by it. They don't get this. Even though what I just told you is in every economics textbook, taught normally by everybody. They just like everybody understood that Russia and China could buy all the gas and oil Russia can produce for the next 50 years. Do we really want to develop that business? Because when the war in Ukraine is over, the Russians might decide we're not going to sell to Europe. Why should we risk them doing that to us again? We're going with our new buddies. That's, by the way, that's where they're building the pipelines, which will be another big argument to stay with that. They've invested enormous amounts of money in building pipelines from Russia into India and into China. There were some already. They've expanded all. You're cementing in the isolation of the United States. And I say this thing publicly. And if there were refutations of this, I would have worked on them because I'd have to respond to them. And I'd like to anticipate so someone who hears me doesn't say I'm wrong because they hear something else. There are no refutations. I'm dealing with stuff that I'm saying that other people need to not talk about. My guess is they will eventually, and then they'll find counter arguments to mine. That's how kind of human beings work. I'm sure they're there. But I don't have to worry about them yet, because the game so far is to pretend, no, we're winning in Ukraine. We're not winning in Ukraine. We have lost. It's not even a question. It's over. Oh, it may take longer, and there may be this or that, but that's a no-win situation. And the basic reason is that for the Russians, it's not important enough to take any real risk. And for the West, that's the same thing. What leader of the United States wants to go to the American people and say, we just lost New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and LA to nuclear weapons in the struggle for Ukraine? What? Most Americans don't know what Ukraine is, or where it is, or who gives a crap. And the truth about Israel is the same. I live in a neighborhood, I would say a third of the people here in Manhattan, a third of the people there, maybe a quarter, are Jewish. Most of them don't give a shit. They just don't. Oh yeah, they have an opinion, but it's this. They're busy with their lives and their jobs, and they just, yeah.
No skin in the game.
No, very little. And so they don't pay much attention. And when they don't pay much attention, then the daily headline, the little snippet on the evening news, doesn't do anything for them. That makes them even more distant and alienated. You know, they know who Netanyahu is. They know Palestine. Actually, they're more touched by, I saw that the other day. There was a march. It wasn't very many people, maybe 200 people down the street, preceded by 2 cop cars, and they had Palestinian flags, and they were shouting some slogan I couldn't quite make out, but it was clearly pro-Palestinian. And people stopped and asked, what's that? They handed out. That will have more impact in my neighborhood than anything else, for and against, but because it touches their lives. The other stuff is just way over there. The only difference, there are people who have Jewish people who have relatives in Israel. They are a bit more clued in because they, I guess, email or something they hear. By the way, I have relatives in Israel too. Cousins who left Swiss, originally Swiss, left Switzerland and went to Israel. And they are settlers. They're on the border there. They're particularly vulnerable and particularly aggressive. They know what I think. They don't know what to do with it. It just sits there.
Well, I'd like to zoom out a little bit to look again at the broader conflict as a whole in the shifting global economy. And you said earlier that the United States represents global capitalism.
Yes.
And I imagine that the United States, England, some of our other allies, we also represent this antiquated colonial model as well. I am wondering what model, what ism, whether you see it as Marxism, Communism, Socialism, or some other ism, that Russia, China, et al. Represent, and how this dynamic is playing out on the global scale.
Good.
And how it relates to the fading of the American empire.
Good question. but like all good questions, takes a bit to answer. I think the best way to start, and why discussions like this are valuable, is to teach those who don't already know that socialism is the common language or the common term I'm about to use, but only after explaining that that term has variations and is not agreed to by people, and never has been. Typically, it's in countries that are anti-socialist that the word socialist is kind of thrown around as if we all understand it and we all define it in the same way. So, for example, yesterday, Donald Trump's campaign officially released both statements and images. The image is of Kamala Harris at the Democratic National Convention, surrounded by red flags. They used artificial intelligence to color all the flags red. And in case anyone missed it, it's Kamala Harris, the socialist in language, and Kamala Harris, the communist. So notice here, communism and socialism, pretty much synonyms, and both equally applicable to Kamala Harris.
You're saying that for the purposes of this image, they're meant to be equated as synonyms, or you view them as synonymous?
No, I mean, they're meant to be equated.
Okay, great.
And I believe that is a general understanding.
I think so.
And I say that to you based on, my 50 years of teaching here in the United States at half a dozen different universities. My students, in general, there are exceptions, but my students, communist, socialist, Marxist, radical, terrorist, anarchist, pretty much the same. Yes, a clever student will show you there's some nuance here, but it's a nuance. I mean, basically, we kind of know. Leftist could throw that in there too. Hey, but let's be fair. China's official self-definition, mainland China, is socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's what they call their society. And they have for many years. That's their name. By the way, no country called itself communist. It's the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, not communism was the name of the party that fought for socialism. That's been true everywhere. Only in the United States. Really. Only in the United States. I mean, there may be another country that I'm missing. But it's basically the United States where socialists and communists are just synonyms. They are communist Russia, communist China. The Russians never called their society communist, and the Chinese never did either. None of them. Mao didn't, Lenin didn't, none of them. I mean, I know this stuff. I've written books about it all. And they called themselves socialists. Socialism was what comes after, in their view, capitalism. The goal of socialism is to go much further to something called communism. But we don't have that yet, and they never claimed they did. Never. The adjective communist is attributed by the writer in the New York Times, not by them. It's as if, I called you not Earhart, but I insisted on calling you Earhart. And you would say, excuse me, it's Earhart. I'd say, yes, of course, Mr. Earhart. But that's irritating because it's a kind of disrespect. It's a kind of put down. I'm going to call you whatever I want, that kind of behavior. Anyway, so here's a real problem. The leader of Spain right now, a man named Pedro Sanchez, is the head of something called the Socialist Party of Spain. That's the government. By the way, this will come as a shock to America. Every time I explain to them how socialists are in power in Europe, they want to quarrel with me, but they know by then, they've checked me out. I'm not crazy. So anyway, Pedro Sanchez is a socialist. So he calls himself a socialist. He calls his party Socialist Party. It's a big party in Spain. That's why he's the prime minister of that country. The largest bloc of seats in the French National Assembly is now in the hands of a party called the New Popular Front, Nouvelle Front Populaire in French. The leader of that, a man named Jean-Luc Mélenchon, a name you probably never heard, and most of the people have never heard. Okay, his party has the most seats. Ready? He was in the Communist Party of France. He left it and became part of the Socialist Party of France. He now runs the party called France Unbowed. That's the name of his party. That's part of the New Front Populaire. And he's the de facto leader in France. He's a socialist who was all of that makes perfect sense in French politics because there's a socialist party and separately a communist party, and they don't get along. And they haven't for a long time. So if you and I were sitting in France, we would be able to talk about the difference between the socialist and communist view on something, and we wouldn't have to explain anything because everybody knows that. Why? Because in many French families, my own included, there are people who are socialists and people who are communists and people who are neither. And they all get together on a picnic at the park at the same time. And it's famous that Uncle Louis and Cousin Jean will have an argument. Because we all know one of them is in Party X. That's normal in a lot of European countries. Americans can't get their heads around. But we're not talking about the moon here, right? For most of the last 10 years, the government of Portugal was a coalition of three parties. The Portuguese Socialist Party, the Portuguese Green Party, and the Portuguese Communist Party. It's the government. It isn't right now. It lost the last election. But before that, the last two governments were them. And this is common. Europeans have all been connected in one way or another to socialists and communists. Have you ever gone to Paris?
I have.
Okay. Have you used the subway, what's called the métro there?
Yeah, a long time ago when I was a kid.
Okay. The métro it's a wonderful system in Paris, really gets you around everywhere. Everybody uses it. It is unionized, has been for decades. And that union is closely affiliated with the Communist Party. You got on a train driven by a communist, cleaned by a communist, maintained by a communist. You're an American tourist. You had no idea. Your life was in the hands of all these communists.
God forbid.
Yeah. So, why am I telling you this? Because to answer your question requires understanding difference. But once I do it, I think you'll understand global economics in a radically new way. So that's the dessert. So bear with me as we go through the meeting. Okay. For some people, socialism is very minimally understood. And here I'm going to put together Scandinavians, Western Europeans, Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They're socialists. They all accept and don't run away from the label socialist. What do they mean? They mean a society in which factories, offices, and stores, businesses in short, enterprises, are owned and operated privately, in which employers, a small minority, hire most people as employees to work in the factories, offices, and stores. That's what they understand. Well, why is that not the United States or Britain, which they would call capitalist? Their answer is because we want the government of our society, Denmark or US, or whatever, we want the government to intervene massively to soften the hard edges of capitalism. I'm going to give you examples so it's clear. Capitalists like to get away with paying very low wages to their employees. That makes the employees' lives difficult. We are in favor of minimum wages, a law which says you cannot pay that person what you're paying him now. That's not enough. There's a floor. You cannot, you go below the floor, we're going to arrest you. You can't do it. For example, and you come from California, there's a perennial problem because the growers in California want to hire immigrants from Mexico to work for nothing or as close to nothing as they can get it. And then this constant issue and with grapes, remember for years there was grape boycotts and all of that. Those grapes were picked that way, and wine is a big deal in California. All right. But the socialists disagree on how much government intervention there should be. So, for example, there are socialists who think it's appropriate to tax corporations and the rich, but not more than you tax others. You should tax, and so they do. Then there are others who say, are you crazy? The tax should be progressive. In other words, the richer you are, the higher the percentage of your wealth you should pay. So if you're a poor person, you pay 5%. If you're a rich person, you pay 50%, or some other formula. Okay, that's a bigger intervention. Let me take it another step. There are socialists who say we have to have an office of safety and health. Corporations are constantly shortcutting, protecting their workers from too much heat or bad air or shitty water or whatever. And so the government has to come in and monitor and control and regulate, right? Now, there's a whole school of socialism that understands there are different kinds of socialism depending on how far into the economy the government is supposed to go to take away its hard edges, right? Should the government give everybody a free education? Should the government give everybody free medical care? By the way, in France, a country I know real well because of my family, the university is free. In Germany, the university is free. Undergraduate and graduate is free. I could keep saying this. Americans need to hear it. It's been that way a long time. My French family, when a child is born, they're covered by a medical insurance, as is the birth. And they are covered until they die. That's it. You injure yourself. I've been a visiting professor at the University of Paris. And when I got my little certificate, it said on it, this is a certificate for your medical. When I had a couple of things, I strep throat or something, I went to the medical system, gave them my card, and that's it. They took care of me. Nobody,
Just because you were a professor?
Because I was a visiting professor. I had a special.
Wow.
If you're sitting, yes. If you teach for less than a month, you're not a member. If you do teach for more than a month, as I did, they take something out, by the way. They take out a premium or whatever, your share. But that's all. They take it out of your weekly. You don't pay. The doctors are all on salary. The doctors explained that to me. We're on salary, we don't depend on how many of you come in here. So they would chat with me. They weren't under the gun to have 15, more people, and none of that. By the way, there was nobody in the office except the doctor. They don't need a clerk. Well, 4. They take my card, stick it in a computer, and there everything there is, and they type in what it is, what's wrong with me, what medication they prescribe, and so forth. Then they said you have to have a lab test. You go down the street, gave them the same card. No one ever billed me. No one ever asked a nickel from it, nothing. But as he explained to me, he says, it's not like your system. We don't have to charge you. We don't need half the money you guys do, because we're not paying 400 secretaries and technicians and clerks. We don't pay one person who's a secretary of my office to fight for weeks with a secretary in the insurance company office over how much we're going. None of that happens here.
One of the ironies I find in what you're saying right now is one of the most common criticisms you hear about socialism and communism is that they lead to this endless bureaucratic bloat that makes it radically less efficient than capitalism.
Yeah, look, that's like telling you that around Christmas time, a reindeer with a red nose is going to show up. Be sure to be nice to him because he has presents. This is an appropriate thing to tell a 4-year-old. But if you're 9, it doesn't work. For adults in the United States to be told such stuff is only possible on the basis of ignorance. They cannot know. And that's why, anyway, when I explain what I just did with you, which I do in my classes, they also all look at me. They want to be told what they expect, that somehow going into a medical office will be confronted with reams of bureaucrats. It's exactly the opposite. By the way, are there bureaucrats in socialist systems? Of course there are, and probably lots of them. But we're not ahead on that score. We got bureaucrats up the wazoo. It's just they work in private, not in the public office. So we don't see them in the, we don't see them in the public office because they're in the private. But they're there. Are you kidding? That's an enormous part of the people who graduate from colleges in this country. That's who they are. They're going to go in all those jobs at various levels. Anyway, let me continue. So if you do Western European socialism or you listen to Bernie, that's what he's about. Bernie gives you idea. I want to tax billionaires. Yep. And I want to control. There should be a minimum wage. That's this guy. We should have national health for everybody. You know what he's doing? He's proposing that the modest levels of support you get in this country be raised to the much more generous levels of support you have in Europe. By the way, most of the rest of the world is in between. More than the United States, less than in Western Europe. In a few countries, Brazil has national health insurance for everybody. They want that. They got that. They also have socialist leaders, like Lula right now. He's a socialist. Of course he's a socialist, has always been a socialist. All right, so then what are communists? What's the difference, or what's at stake here? Well, first of all, communists have been people who are communists because they're members of a communist party, usually. If they use a large C, then that's what they mean. If it's a little c, then they like the ideas, but they're not necessarily in a party. Many countries have communist parties, many countries don't. Socialist parties you see almost everywhere. Even the United States has always had a socialist party, even though it's very small, except at the beginning of the 20th century when it became big. If you're not familiar with American history, 1912, 1916, 1924. That period, you had a major union leader, Eugene Victor Debs by name, D-E-B-S, head of the Railway Workers Union in this country, also a socialist, leader of the American Socialist Party, ran for president of the United States, got 1 million votes. Back then, when 1 million is a big percentage of the total vote. It would be significant to get 1 million now, but imagine then when you're talking about a population that was a small fraction of what it is now. Not only that, he was in prison. He was in prison as the head of the Socialist Party when he ran and got 1 million votes in this country. So when people tell you socialism can never be in the United States, it's again ignorance talking, number one. Number two, why was he in prison? He was in prison because as head of the Socialist Party, at the outbreak of World War I, he went around the country, because there was no radio or television yet, giving speeches urging American workers not to participate in the war on the argument this is a war among capitalists who are fighting to grab hold of the world. No working man should be killing other working men for them. For that, he was arrested and put in jail. Several leaders around the world reacted to World War I with the same words. One of them was Vladimir Lenin, who had to leave Russia because the alternative would have been he would have been in prison. He left and went to live in Zurich, Switzerland, where he was during World War I. Anyway, give you another example. I do a game with my students. I said, I'm going to ask you a question none of you can answer. In what state were the most socialists running on the Socialist Party ticket elected to the state legislature? Which of the 50 states had the most? First of all, my student, socialists elected to the legislature? Yeah. Which of the states had the most? Oklahoma. So for people that's the truth. They not only don't they know anything about their own history, but they don't understand that a state that is as right-wing as Oklahoma is now was once other. Because it's very important to teach that to students, because what was can come back. So if they happened before, now you have to ask, well, why did all those rural people in Oklahoma, why did they vote for socialism? Turns out lots of rural people vote for socialism. One of the strongest areas in France right now for the French Communist Party is the rural, the agricultural, the farmers. Anyway, shouldn't surprise you, it's happened all the time. What's a communist? A communist usually is a former socialist who changed his or her mind about something. And the best way to understand it is, again, a little history, as it often is. World War I was a crucial moment for all socialists. Would they fight or not? Debs and Lenin said, we will not fight. And they went to jail, or they were exiled because of it. Many socialists said we have to be loyal in our country. So, for example, the majority of German, because socialism was stronger in Germany at the beginning of World War I than anywhere else in the world. I mean, Marx was German, and one reason for that. So the Socialist Party split. It had elected many deputies to the parliament, and under parliamentary rules in Germany, as in many countries, the money for fighting World War I had to be voted by the parliament. The Reichstag, it's called in Germany, the Bundesrat later. And if they didn't get a majority of the votes, they couldn't fight a war. The Kaiser at that time, the leader of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm, he could declare a war, which he did, but he couldn't fight it unless the bourgeoisie voted through its representatives to give him the money authority, the taxes and the printing authority to go ahead and do it, which was typical in all the countries. So the socialists, who were huge, the second largest party in Germany at the time of World War I was the Socialist Party. That's how strong they were. They had to decide what are their deputies going to do. If they had voted as a bloc against it, either the war wouldn't have happened or it would have happened very differently. What are you going to do, arrest them all? It's your second biggest party. You have real trouble in your country. So the tremendous pressure put on them, and they split. A majority of them went with the government and voted what were called war credits, voted for it. A minority voted against. They were arrested. And the most famous among those arrested, a Socialist Party delegate to the German government, was a woman named Rosa Luxemburg. If you ever heard of her, that's why you've heard of her. Okay, so long story short, the war is now over, but the memories are bitter. Germany has lost the war, so everybody who voted for it is in the doghouse politically. The Kaiser is gone. Germany has lost. Devastated country. And it has reparations to pay to Britain, France, for the war. That was a new development. Make the loser pay for the war. So the Germans were. Who were the heroes? The few socialists who refused. They now, in retrospect, looked like the wise ones. We should have followed them. We wouldn't be in this terrible position. But they were very bitter against each other. Very bitter, these two. Because it was life and death for many of them and their families and everything else. Plus, a radical thing had changed the world. In one country, Russia, in the middle of World War I, 1917, remember the war goes from 1914 to 1918, in the middle of 1917, a revolution happens inside one of the warring countries, Russia, in which socialists take over and become the new government. You cannot understand modern history if you do not understand the importance of this. What it did was it made every socialist in the world say, oh my God, we've never done it. We've been an opposition party. We've been radicals, but we haven't won anywhere. Closest thing, if you know about it, was something called the Paris Commune. For a few weeks in 1871, the working class took over the city of Paris and ran it, threw out the government and ran it themselves, called the Paris Commune. Marx was still alive and was involved from London with it. Wrote one of the greatest things he ever wrote about it, what mistakes they made. That was what was used by Lenin later to try to strategize the Russian Revolution, not to make the mistakes that they had made. Not he was a child then, but anyway. Every socialist everywhere, no matter what she thought, realized they figured it out. These three famous men, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, the three. There were other leaders, but they were the three who came to be known, partly because of stuff that happened later. They figured it out. These Russians figured out how to take the next step of capturing a government. So the socialists around the world said, we have to support them. In case you don't know, because so many Americans don't, the revolution happens late in 1917, basically October, November. By 1918, four countries decide to invade Russia to crush this new communist, socialist, whatever government. Those four countries were Britain, France, United States, and Japan. They all sent troops to work with the Russians inside the country who were against the revolution. Rural people, right-wing people, religious people, lots of them too. There was a civil war going on inside the Russian Revolution. After the revolution, and it pitted the Red Army against the White Army, that's what they were called. Trotsky was in charge of the Red Army, and they were fighting to see whether the revolution would survive. And the White Army got the assistance of troops from Britain, France, United States, and Japan. By the way, footnote, 10,000 troops, Americans, were landed in Russia to fight against the new socialist government. Did Russians ever land in the United States to fight anybody? Never. Who, therefore, has the right to be afraid of whom? Anyway, put all that aside. The Red Army won, the White Army was defeated, those foreign armies were driven out. The last Japanese soldier left in 1922. The world of socialism split all around the world. Those who believed you had to support whatever the Russians did, whatever the Soviets did, they were the ones who figured it out. They knew how to capture power. We got to go with them. And their great leader, great at least the first 5 years, because that's as long as he lived. From 17, he died in 22 or 23. 22. Lenin, the great leader, was also a theoretician, a scholar. I don't know if you ever studied any of his work. The best book, I think, to this day, written on Russian economic history, written by Lenin. 600 pages, which I've actually read. 600 pages analyzing how Russia came to be the successful, fantastic scholarship in detail. And anyway, kind of leader you don't get too terribly often. And not just for that reason, but in any case. So the world split, and the socialists who said Russia is the way, is the future, said we have to change our name, and they called themselves communists. The other ones who didn't like Russia or weren't so sure or called themselves socialists. And they split, and for example, in a place like France, that's the date when the Communist Party was founded, 1920, 21, and there have been Communist Party versus Socialist Party with lots of bitterness ever since. And you have that in many, many other countries, including the United States. That's when the Communist Party is formed here. By whom? By ex-socialists out of that split. But it took on another meaning. In Russia, again, for long reasons, I have a book, if you're ever interested, which goes through the rise and fall of the economic system of the Soviet Union.
For our listeners, what's it called?
The book is called Theory. What is it? Theory and History, Capitalism and Communism in the USSR. Anyway, it took on another meaning, to get to the meat of your question, especially after Stalin, or in Stalin's time. Russia decided that traditional socialism was inadequate under the new circumstances. It wouldn't be adequate, they said, for the government to tax and regulate. And it's not a question, they said, of more or less taxing and regulating. Way had divided socialists and created the gradations I talked to you about. You cannot, this was the argument, you cannot leave the ownership and operation of the enterprise in private hands, because the private owner has a different network of incentives from what the government would have. And the private owners, will find ways to evade, avoid, get around, soften everything the government tries. If the government taxes them, they'll figure out how to escape it. The government regulates them, they'll figure out how to escape. By the way, the United States is an illustration that they had something to say. Anyway, their solution was the government should take over the ownership and operation. Many socialists had never said that. Many socialists to this day don't want that, don't believe in it. The Russian model, what became the Soviet model of socialism, had the government owning and operating. Therefore, the government said, we can be now much more confident that the tax we impose, the regulation we impose, will be followed because these are our people. We're going to name who's on the board of directors. They're going to be state officials, not private individuals. There is no stock market in Russia, Soviet Russia. Nobody can buy a share of a company. We don't have any of that because the government is the... At first it was just industry, not agriculture. Eventually they created what were called state farms that were state enterprises with farmers. So what became the key difference between communists and socialists? Communists wanted state ownership and operation. Socialists did not. And to this day in Western Europe, socialists do not demand what would be called the nationalization or the socialization of enterprises. They don't. At most, what they do is particular ones. These, they say, are important enough that the government should run them. So, for example, you may remember when you went to Paris years ago that everybody there smokes very strong cigarettes with names like Gitane or Gauloise, right? At that time, it's not anymore, but at that time, those were government businesses. The government, because tobacco had to be taxed, and tobacco had a certain sinfulness attached to it, like alcohol, that the government insisted we're going to produce. Okay, so the French government produced all those cigarettes. To this day in France, the railways are all nationalized. So the SNCF, which is the Railroad of France, is a government operation. So it used to be that oil and gas and telephone and airline were, Air France, that was a government operation. Now, because of the power of the United States in the second half of the 20th century, a number of those socialist ownerships have been privatized, have been sold back into the private sector. So Air France is once again a private company. And I think the EDF, that's called Électricité de France, their utility there is now once again private. But that's the part of socialism in France that was undone. But there were other parts of socialism that were not. For example, just to give you an idea, if you have a baby in France, the government assigns you a social worker. You don't have to accept them if you don't want them, but you get one automatically. And the cost is nothing. And that person is there to help you, I think, the first 6 months. And you can ask them to do anything, change the baby, bathe the baby, go out shopping. The assumption is you need help as a new parent, to get used to all of that. So you get this. National health, the higher education. Bread is subsidized in France. The socialists pushed all that stuff through. Here's one that Americans always look at me and they get that sad look in their face, like the puppy who hasn't gotten his bone to chew. I say to them, in France, it's the law. The minute you graduate from high school or college, you take your first job. Your employer has to give you 5 weeks paid vacation every year. That you don't have to bargain for it, go on strike for it, ask for it. No. It's automatic. Because it's part of a decent life that you have time off without having to worry about the money. Americans look at me as if I have described to them some magical place way up in the sky in heaven that some nasty person invented just to make them feel bad that they don't have anything like it. I tell them most Americans don't get 5 weeks paid vacation after 20 years on the job. I mean, it's just socialists did that. And so popular is it that no conservative government, and there have been many, would dare touch it because they'd be voted out of office in 10, maybe 12 minutes. It's like the first demonstration I ever went on in France. I mean, I speak French. I go there all the time. We were coming out, my wife and I, coming out of the hotel, and there's a demonstration. And the first thing we see is a group of women coming in the red flag with hammer and sickle. Very clear who they are. They're communist women. They're marching, and we asked them in French, what are you marching for? Daycare. The government just proposed to privatize daycare. That was not what caught my attention. Because right behind them in the demonstration, were 6 nuns, Catholic nuns, carrying the banner of St. Peter, whatever the hell the church was that they came from. And they were chatting, they all knew each other. They all come from the same, the districts of Paris are called arrondissements, regions. And they were all from the same region. They all knew each other. They were joking, having a wonderful time. It was too much for an American. Communists and nuns having a good time. They all knew each other. What? And the answer is, where did the government locate the daycare centers? In the basements of the churches. France is a Catholic country, so most of the churches are Catholic churches. So the Catholic Church was getting money from the government to pay for giving the basement to the little kiddies so they could play, and the nuns or whoever they hired would supervise them. The communists wanted it because the working class wants to have daycare without paying for it. The church wants the rent. So they were working together. You know, it's just a different way of, that exists all to this day, free daycare and everything. When I taught there, I knew a professor who brought me there. He had a 7-year-old daughter. Every morning at 7, he and his wife both had jobs. He was a professor, she was a psychiatrist. Every morning at 7 o'clock, they brought Sandrine, was her name, typical French girl's name. They brought Sandrine to the public daycare center in the neighborhood they lived. She could stay there until 7 o'clock at night, 12 hours. She had her own little outfit, which I saw. They would give her breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And it cost $14 a week. You could come if you didn't want the whole day, if you had time off, you want to be with your kid, but pick them up after 2 hours, pick them up for lunch. All of that, it had to be done in advance, but as long as they had a schedule, everything, you know. And he would explain to me, he said, you live a completely different life from me. He said, you worry about having enough money to put your kid to college. I don't. You worry about having your toddler in the daycare center. I don't. These are 2 enormous expenses, and I have health insurance. You don't. And he does pay for that. I mean, he pays for the child care too, but it's ridiculous. It's subsidized. And they have, in every school has to be a nurse and all of that. And you should see the way they're French. So they eat. You know, Americans would be jealous. The children 14 and up get a little glass of wine. Anyway, so the communists and the socialists differed over that. Now, here comes the biggest point of all. Socialism and communism have always included people who do not believe that you get socialism unless you change the organization of work. In other words, they don't want to hear about more government, less government. For them, those are different kinds of capitalism. And you can prefer one to the other. That makes sense. You can be a passionate person about having the government have minimum wages in daycare centers and pensions for old people and all. Oh, fine. They're for that. Being lefty types, they're for all of that. But for them, I'm going to exaggerate now, but not by much. That has nothing to do with socialism. You can call it that, we don't care. But we would prefer you to do a little bit of respect for this other definition that's always been there, and that is in Marx, in case you need an authority for it. Here's how it goes. For much of the recent history of the world, recent being 2,000-3,000 years, maybe a bit more, an awful lot of production of goods and services that we all depend on, our food, our clothing, our shelter, all of that, has been organized with a small group of people in a position of power and dominance, and a mass of people who do the bulk of the work. In slavery, it's the master and the slave. In feudalism, it's the lord and the serf. Here we go now. And in capitalism, it's the employer and the employee. Therefore, we, socialists and communists, who don't agree with this more or less government, we are the ones whose argument is to have socialism, you have to get over the dichotomy as a way of organizing production. Not just get rid of master-slave, not just get rid of lord and serf. That was, if you will allow me, the mistake of the revolutionaries who brought us capitalism. They thought overcoming slavery and overcoming feudalism was the path to liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy. In other words, Jefferson, John Locke were wrong. Because the problem is capitalism cannot usher in democracy because it is fundamentally undemocratic itself. It doesn't break from the employer-employee model. Therefore, for us, these people would argue, socialism requires that break. Whatever the government is designed to do or not do, what has to change is the organization of production. It has to be, and now I'm going to be sharp with you, but to make the point, you have to finally democratize the enterprise. That which democracy was excluded from the beginning. How strange, the place that adults spend most of their lives at work, 9 to 5, an hour or two beforehand brushing your teeth to get ready, an hour or two at the bar with the happy hour recovering from. This is your life, Jack, 5 out of 7 days. If you believe in democracy, this is the first place, but we don't allow it there. We think it's important to vote to elect the mayor because he has influence over us. The mayor makes decisions we have to live with, so we must have some democratic power over the mayor. Yo, Jack, when you go to work, the CEO, he's not only got the power to affect your life, he can fire you. He can take away your life and your family and your community. You don't elect him. You have no power over him at all. There is no democracy in the capitalist workplace. Now, why is this important, this definitional matter? Because if you use this, you understand that what has happened in the world economy is not the passage from capitalism to socialism, from their point of view. It's from one kind of capitalism to another, from American capitalism to Chinese capitalism. In China, you have employers and employees, both private and public, because China is an interesting hybrid. It takes half of China is like the United States and Britain, private companies, private employers, all that. The other half is government. So half Soviet, half American. It's figured out a hybrid which has the following interesting quality. Grows a hell of a lot faster than either of the others, which isn't so surprising. It's why you make hybrids. Every farmer in America will tell you that. Okay, so, wow. Then what is China? China is a new kind of capitalism. It mingles socialism, lots of government, lots. It mingles the old socialism, government regulating private enterprise, that's half of China. And it mingles Soviet socialism, the other half of the Chinese economy, government-owned, operated enterprises. Wow, wow. It's the latest kind of socialism. And it calls itself that. And it has a communist party that's in charge of managing the socialism that they have. But the irony is, it still leaves the open question, which comes from Marx, that the issue is beyond all of that. Not that that isn't important. Look, it's created China. It's created a whole new world economy. I don't want to minimize that at all. But it still leaves open that the next step in human evolution will be, whether it happens first in the US with a declining capitalism, or first in China with a rising capitalism, who will be the first and why to make the break and to try to organize a democratized economic system? And the kernels of it, the seeds of it, the beginning, are the existence of worker co-ops that are all over the world, including in the United States, and have been here for a long time. It's not a question of discovering something new. It's a question of readapting an older form under new circumstances to play a new role in society. And my guess is you're going to see more and more of it. And often I'm asked, is this a lovely image for the future? No. I mean, it may be, but that's not all it is. We have it here and now. And let me give you an example. The most successful experiment so far is in Spain. It's a place called Mondragon, Mondragon, Mondragon. That's the name of a small city just south of the Pyrenees Mountains that separate Spain from France. I've been there, so I'm a personal witness. But they started when a Catholic priest in 1956, which was then a very, very poor region, said to his parishioners, very famous, name is Father Arizmendi. By the way, that's the name of a bakery in the Bay Area in California, Arizmendi.
Arizmendi.
And that's why it's a worker co-op named after this priest in Spain, long dead, who says to his parishioners, if we wait for an employer to come here to give us a job, we'll all die of old age before it happens. So I have an idea. Why don't we become our own boss? And he sets up with 6. He sets up the first worker co-op in that area. It's now the 7th largest corporation in all of Spain.
Oh, wow. And still a co-op.
Yes, but now it's a family of about 200 co-ops under one corporate umbrella called the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. Look it up. It's full of document. Google will take you there right away. Look, it has its problems. No one is presenting this as the great nirvana. But if you want to know, can you organize a worker co-op? Yes. Have they done so? Yes. Have they had failures and successes? Yes. Have they learned from all of that? Yes. Have they collected all they've learned? Yes. Mondragon is so successful it has over 100,000 employees now, including the largest supermarket chain in Spain. It runs its own university, I've been there, teaching its own courses on how to start a worker co-op, how to run a worker co-op, how to finance a worker co-op, how to deal with the interpersonal problems if you don't have a hierarchy. I mean, all the problems you can imagine, they already have had practical experience with. So we, if we did this in the United States, which I hope we will, wouldn't have to start from scratch, wouldn't have to invent it all. A lot of this has been done if we're just open to it. The largest savings bank in Germany is a co-op. You know, The co-ops, Britain has lots of co-ops. Italy has a law on the books. Forget the name of the guy, the name of the Italian legislature who goes with the law. Anyway, here's the law. If you get on and it's still a law, it was passed in 1985, and so it's whatever it is, 40 years old now. Under this law in Italy, if you become unemployed, you have a choice. A, you can do like we do in this country. You can go on what is there called the dole. England calls it that too. You get a weekly check for a year or whatever you're entitled to help you through the unemployment. You could do that. Or you can choose Plan B. Plan B is the following. The government will give you your fully entitled weekly sum for the whole thing, in one lump sum right now, under the following conditions. One, this is your unemployment. If you need it again, the government will not help you. You got yours. Two, you have to use this as seed money for a worker co-op. And you have to do it with at least 9 other recipients of unemployment who make the same choice. In other words, it's a way to deal with unemployment that says, here, we don't think it's all that good for you to be on the dole for a year. You're going to lose your self-esteem. You're going to have strains in all the things we know go with unemployment. We don't want you to have that. And we know that if we give you this money and you can't come back, you're going to do your damnedest to make this work. So we're going to hear 10 or more of you. We'll let you, and they have worker co-ops around Italy because they were basically, and it didn't cost the government anything extra because they would have given them that money anyway.
That is such a foreign law to me.
Yeah, isn't that interesting though? Interesting? I forget, I can look it up and get it for you if you're ever interested. I just forget the name of the legislator whose name is on it. They've tried to get rid of it, and it's very popular, so they couldn't do it. So I think that's the future, and I think the answer to the question is that's what the next stage of human history is. Whatever we think of democracy, the reason our political democracy, to the extent we have one, doesn't work as well as it could or should, is because we try to marry it with an economic system that is not democratic. When you cross the threshold into your factory, your office, your store, you give up democracy. You are agreeing by taking the job to be told what to do, how to do, where to do it, when to do it, and that somebody else will tell you, we don't need you anymore, go home. It's Friday, have a nice weekend, don't come back on Monday. I mean, it's incredible that we do that. That's not democracy. We have no say in that. Somebody else decides whether what we do is valuable or not, adequate or not. I mean, it's amazing. We accept this. There will come a time when we will not. Just like people accepted there has to be a king. I make a joke in my classes. We didn't get rid of kings. We allowed them to change their name and come back with a disguise. We call them CEOs. That's what they are, little kings in their little kingdoms, where they sit in the prime office with lots of furnishings and lots of servants and tell everybody else what to do. We got rid of the king. We don't regret it. Let's get rid of the king and the enterprise. We won't regret it either. It will not only make the enterprise into a democratic community, but it'll make the effort to do it where we live much realer than it is now.
To finish this off and just to be comprehensive, I'm just wondering what you think, and granted you're not a soothsayer, but what your prognostication is, your forecast for what's going to happen between the United States and China or G7 and the BRICS in the next 10 to 20 years or so.
Well, it is a summary of what I said earlier. A decision is going to be made, and it'll be mostly made by the United States. That's not because the United States is more powerful or because I think that China is good and America is bad. I don't think that any more than the reverse. China now understands through practical experience, not its ideology. China understands that time is on its side. Why? Because it has been for 30 years. For 30 years, their system has outgrown the United States. For the last 10 or 15 years, everything the United States has tried to slow them or stop them has failed. Trump's tariff wars, Trump's trade wars, all of the activity Mr. Biden continued against China that he inherited from Trump. It was all designed to change their policies. It hasn't. It was all designed to slow them down relative to the United States. Hasn't really done that either. So they're more powerful than they were, and that's been true now for so long that they're not going to change much. They're winning. Their time is on their side. For the United States, it's exactly the opposite. Everything fails. For the United States, they're getting desperate. What's left? Well, saber rattling in the South China Sea, deciding that that offshore island, Taiwan, is some kind of important thing. I mean, try to imagine if the Chinese Navy were buzzing around Staten Island. I mean, what? You know, it's pure provocation. So for me, I see the Chinese, time is on our side, versus the United States, time is against us. And so I imagine there are many people in the American military saying, we have to have the war with them now, because if we don't, it'll be worse for us 5 years from now, 10 years. The way things are going, we didn't imagine when Kissinger and Nixon go to China back in whatever it was, 1970, around that time, to open up China to the United States. They weren't afraid of China militarily. They didn't want to get left behind as Europe and Japan made money off dealing with China. Now they're afraid. And they have reason to be. China is a huge power, nuclear weapons, allied with Russia. I mean, that's a powerful alliance. Biggest country by population, with the most militarily armed country probably in the world, which is Russia now, not so much. And certainly in conventional weapons, that's what we're learning in Ukraine. So here's my prognostication. The United States will enter into, soon, a very different debate. And instead of the debate being, what's the best way to contain China, which is the self-delusional debate we're in now, we're going to have a debate between those who want that and those who say, that's stupid. That's so stupid because they're not going to walk away. They've shown no interest in bending to our will. They're not willing to accommodate any of the things we want to throw at them. So we know that. So we're going to have a war. And a war between these two nuclear superpowers is ridiculous. More danger. We have to learn our own history. We, the Americans, have to do with China what the British had to do with the American colony that broke away. Work something out. You can do here, we'll do over there. The planet can handle both of us if we work together, and we will destroy each other, which serves nobody if we don't. I think that will be the debate. And I want to think that the wiser heads will prevail, and another person who will then come to be known as George Washington will say, this is the way we ought to go, and people will say, George, go out there, talk with Xi Jinping or whoever comes later, and work this out. And they will, and they will, and they will work it out. The Chinese do not want to be obliterated by nuclear weapons either. Should come as a surprise to nobody. And the implication of all of this, which I think is already underway, is the utter irrelevance of Europe. And that the worst form of this arrangement, the worst, I hope doesn't happen, would be that the accommodation found between China and the United States comes by an agreement to carve up Europe, each taking portion, and that they will solve all kinds of domestic problems about the accommodation part by saying, well, look what we got. Because Europe, by its disunity and by its historical inheritance, being the bad colonial power that everybody has hateful memories of, cannot play this kind of role and is therefore in the process of losing its whole position. This display now, in which a dispute between the United States and Russia hobbles Europe, and Europe doesn't do anything about it. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar. The inflation in Europe is much worse than here. The unemployment in Europe is much worse than here. The sanctions against Russia hurt Europe, not here, but they were insisted upon here. The governments in Europe that go along with it are right-wing pro-American governments. Their biggest job in the years ahead is to not lose their position in their own countries because of what they did. The conservatives in England, let me conclude in case this is of interest to people, the conservatives in England, since Margaret Thatcher, have been buddy-buddy with the United States. The last election, which only happened a couple of months ago, blew them out of the water. Millions and millions of traditional conservative voters voted them out, brought in the Labour Party, which, by the way, used to be called the Socialist Party in many people's minds in England. The French government, where the largest bloc in the assembly is now socialist, comes to power over the same thing because the previous leaders were all too close to the United States. Okay, the handwriting is on the wall. I don't think people like Meloni in Italy and others, they're not be there very much longer because of their association with closeness to the United States, which looks like the opposite of a winning proposition over the last few years, and they're gonna suffer the political consequences as the left wing has an easy time. Right now, in Germany, for example, you have a rising new star on the left, a woman, by the way, if you want to interview someone, get another perspective. I don't know if the name means anything to you yet. It will. Sarah, first name, Wagenknecht in German, but with a W, because W in German is pronounced with a V. So Wagenknecht, she's the left, socialist, left-wing socialist. And on the right, the, I don't know what the first word, Aufstand für Deutschland, AfD, a right-wing party. They are both destroying the middle. And then the same argument, you're too close to the United States. Both of them don't want the war in Ukraine either. They just forced the parliament yesterday in Germany to say we're not going to cancel the money we promised in previous years, which still has to be spent. But as of 26, so not this year, not next year, but as of 26, no more money for Ukraine. Now, what does that mean? The parliament can make a different decision next week. But it's a sign in the wind. That wasn't possible 6 months ago. Now, the population in Germany is so angry that they're the ones paying the bill for this big American policy. They don't want a war in Ukraine. They don't want a war anywhere near Europe. They know what war is. Americans don't. They don't want this.
All right, Richard. Well, this is, I think, the fourth time on the show now. Every time seems better than the last. So thank you so much
You're
for the
very
conversation.
welcome.